beginning of Temple Judah, 100 years ago, artifacts such as committee reports, yearly accomplishments, newspaper clippings, mortgages, photos, and so forth were being saved that would show the history of Temple as it developed. Those items became our archives. The Anniversary Committee thought it would be interesting to go through the archives and create a film showing that history. The archives turned out to be a very large number of boxes in 2 separate rooms, along with a full 4-drawer filing cabinet. Such a film could be made, but it would take a Ken Burns production crew to create it. So a slight change to the plan was made to limit the film to essentially the beginning years of Temple Judah. And that is what this is. In the late 1800s, immigration from Poland and Russia to the United States was ongoing. The beginning of an organized Jewish community in Cedar Rapids occurred in 1895, when several immigrant families established the Eben Israel Cemetery Association. Next, they hired a Jewish butcher so they would have access to kosher meats. 11 years later, in 1906, they founded Beth Jacob, an Orthodox shul. One of our members, Herman Ginsberg, has childhood memories of attending Beth Jacob with his father. Herman's son, Steve, captured some of those memories in an interview with his dad.
Welcome, Herman Ginsberg.
Whoa, welcome to me. Yes, Steve.
Look right at the camera.
Hi, Steve.
Well, you can look at me too. That's fine. Did you attend both the Temple Judah and Beth Jacob when you were...
Like many people who belonged to Temple Judah, we also belonged and paid dues to Beth Jacob.
So
I don't know if that was so with people who only belonged to Beth Jacob. I used to go to Beth Jacob with my father, who was not conversant in Hebrew, even though the services at Beth Jacob were almost 100% in Hebrew. I don't recall my mother coming to Beth Jacob. She was very, very active in Temple Judah and was the treasurer of Temple Judah for many, many years that we lived in Cedar Rapids. Beth Jacob also had I used to think of it as a swimming pool, but it was in the basement of Beth Jacob. What's that called?
A mikvah.
Mikvah, yes. They had that in the basement, of which I never went down to look at. My father seemed to go by himself and took me with him to Beth Jacob when he went. Even though, and he wore a tallis, which he would pick up at the Beth Jacob. I remember Beth Jacob had a courtyard with a low fence, a cement fence around the courtyard, and all the Sunday school students, which I wouldn't say that I was a Sunday school student at Beth Jacob. I was at Temple Judah.
You went to both synagogues.
I went to Beth Jacob to learn Hebrew in preparation for my bar mitzvah, but at Sunday school I went to Temple Judah.
Did other kids also go to Beth Jacob for Hebrew and Temple Judah for Sunday school?
I'm trying to think, but I don't think so. I think some, for example, Jerry Greenberg only went to Beth Jacob.
Mm-hmm. When did you become bar mitzvah?
When I was 13 in 1939.
And
at Beth Jacob.
Why were you bar mitzvah at Beth Jacob? It's because you learned Hebrew there?
Yes, and I had no say-so in it. My parents decided that.
Right. So whoever taught you Hebrew was at Beth Jacob.
Yes, and they had a rabbi who was very Orthodox and whose name I can't remember, but he had a daughter here in town, and I don't remember anything about her.
Okay. What details do you recall about your bar mitzvah?
I remember I learned enough Hebrew at Beth Jacob to read out of the Torah, and An aside is that Elaine Smulikov, who was very pretty, gave me a wink as I was giving my speech at the end of my bar mitzvah. And it so unnerved me, I guess, I forgot what line I was on.
Well, you mentioned that the Temple Judah rabbi at the time, David Polish,
He was
came to your bar mitzvah?
I agree with my parents who thought David Polish was the most intellectual person as a rabbi or as a person. David Polish. He came to my bar mitzvah at Beth Jacob, but came late. I was already through. And I remember the look of disappointment on his face when he arrived late, too late to be at my actual bar mitzvah.
So if Beth Jacob was entirely in Hebrew, what was the service like at Temple Judah? Different?
As it is now, it's a smattering of Hebrew, mostly English.
What kind of acceptance was there by Beth Jacob to have a liberal congregation, Temple Judah, in the same town? Was there any discussion, argument?
If there was, there's nothing that I recollect. And I don't think it was known as liberal versus conservative.
Or reform?
Reform versus Orthodox. That's how it was known.
Okay. Did your parents give you instructions on how to behave when you attended the services?
No.
So when you went with Grandpa Izzy to Beth Jacob, did he say you can't talk, be quiet, stay by me? Did he give any?
I always stay by. When he stood up, I stood up. When he sat down, I sat down.
And then the same was for Temple Judah?
No, it wasn't that orthodoxy. It was we were in Temple Judah. We mostly sat and occasionally stood up. During certain prayers, I guess.
Temple Judah's official history, however, begins in 1922, when some of the younger members of this strictly Orthodox synagogue became interested in establishing a more liberal service. This reform group felt that it would be desirable to adopt English into the services. Initially, they had no place of worship, and they called themselves the Congregation of Judah, a name in honor of Philip Liebson's father, Judah Liebson. Judah happens to be the great-great-grandfather of Laurie Silber and Dr. Fred Goldblatt, two of our current members. Philip's wife was very active as a leader of what later became Sisterhood of Congregation of Judah. In February 1922, the Park Avenue Realty Company signed a warranty deed for Congregation of Judah to purchase 2 lots at 1945 and 1947 Washington Avenue Southeast. About a year later, on February 1st, 1923, the building permit was issued by Cedar Rapids to Congregation of Judah. Unfortunately, economic conditions in the country turned to a recession, which was one of several occurring in the 1920s. Congregation of Judah postponed the construction until more prosperous times. In the meantime, the congregation became dormant until the fall of 1924. At that time, a group of Jewish women realizing the need for a modern Reform congregation met at Mrs. Philip Liebson's home to discuss forming a Reform sisterhood and a Reform religious school. They called themselves Sisterhood of Congregation of Judah and soon became an official chapter of the National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods. The group of 25 women met monthly, with their top priority being the starting of a religious school. About that same time, Rabbi Joseph Barron of Davenport became interested in what was occurring in Cedar Rapids and offered to work with the local sisterhood to move the Congregation of Judah into a full-fledged Reformed Jewish congregation and religious school. With the leadership of Rabbi Barron and sisterhood, the first religious school class was held on November 8, 1924. There were 40 children enrolled at this time. Since there was no temple building yet, they accepted an offer by People's Church to use their building for the monthly Friday evening services as well as the weekly Saturday religious school. The Union of American Hebrew Congregations recognized Congregation of Judah, later to become Temple Judah, as an official affiliate on March 2, 1925, by their issuance of a retroactive certificate in 1956. Rabbi Barron conducted those monthly Friday services and made additional trips from Davenport twice a month to help supervise the religious school, which consisted of kindergarten, grade 2, grade 3, and confirmation. Almost 6.5 months after the first religious school class occurred, the first Jewish confirmation service ever held in Cedar Rapids took place on May 30th, 1925 at People's Church for 3 confirmands. Student rabbis from the Hebrew Union College conducted the service. We found this description of the confirmation service in our archives. There, before a large, awe-inspired audience, Rabbi Barron, in a most impressive manner, confirmed a group of 3 young people, Ethelyn Greenbat, Rose Kushner, and Norman Shmulikoff. The children marched in procession with their sweet offering of flowers, which they tenderly placed upon the altar. Solemnly, the confirmands took their vows to carry on the faith of Israel, proudly carrying Israel's lofty banner. And so was the year brought to a close, that first eventful year. About late October 1925, People's Church sent a letter to the Secretary of the Jewish Society of Cedar Rapids stating that their building needs had grown, and they asked that the Congregation of Judah find another meeting place. The congregation secured the use of the Knights of Pythias' hall to continue Shabbat services and religious school. The planning for the second confirmation class included getting free use of the Strand Theater. The confirmation was held on May 23, 1926, for 12 boys and girls. It wasn't long after the second confirmation that the congregation's yearning for a place to call their home intensified. Discussions were held about the feasibility of building on the lot that had been purchased in 1922. A special board of directors meeting was held in October 1926 to authorize the securing of a loan to go ahead with construction. Finally, the construction on the new building began in 1926 and was completed in May 1927. Shortly after that, a dedication ceremony was held. On August 1, 1928, Rabbi Max Schenk took his place as Temple Judah's first resident rabbi. By the way, Rabbi Schenk would go on to be president of the New York Board of Rabbis and president of the American Jewish League for Israel. A Hebrew school began in October 1928 with an enrollment of 28 students. For the first time, the new temple building hosted the confirmation service on June 1, 1930. It was attended by 150 people. Once again, we turn to Herman Ginsberg for his memories of Temple Judah.
Do you recall any of the physical details, the interior, the layout, the rooms of Temple Judah?
Yes. It was very, I think it was a very comfortable feeling. The Sunday school rooms were downstairs. I remember a play that I was in, and we performed it downstairs in the basement on the Washington Avenue.
Perhaps a Purim play?
Could be. I don't remember the occasion or what it was about. You walked into an entryway where people hung their coats.
And that was right on Washington Avenue, steps going up to the door.
Yes. And then you went into the sanctuary from there. In the basement were all the classrooms for the Sunday school. And I think the only thing on the first floor when you walked in was the cloakroom and the sanctuary. What I remember mostly about Temple Judah services is that the Shmulikoff, A.L. Shmulikoff, whose full name was Abraham Lincoln Shmulikoff, they always sat in the front row and took up the almost entire front row with A.L., his wife, Ceile, C-E-I-L-E, and they met. She was from Philadelphia, and for somehow they met and got married and moved to Cedar Rapids, and they had a furniture store here in town.
With the new temple building, activities increased throughout the years as the congregation continued to grow. In 1947, discussions about adding a new auditorium created enough interest that the congregation raise the money rather than take on debt. A couple of years later, congregations Beth Jacob and Temple Judah began discussions about integrating both communities. Ultimately, the integration happened with the two congregations keeping their individual identities. Reform and conservative services were offered on alternate Shabbats. The religious school would teach both congregations' children together, and a traditional cantor would be hired to lead services for the Orthodox members at the High Holy Days.
Do you recollect how or why Temple Judah felt they needed a new building in the 1960s?
Well, the Jewish community here was growing, and becoming too small. One comic afterthought is in the Washington Washington Avenue building. It was raining. It was Kennedy's assassination. There was a special service that day when Kennedy was assassinated, and it was raining, and I had a raincoat. I was wearing a raincoat, and I hung it in the first room you walk into from the street. Also at the same service was Arnold Buxbaum, who's somewhat taller than me. He had a raincoat on that was exactly the same as mine, but much longer. He left and moved to New Jersey with my raincoat. I was left with his raincoat that went down to my ankles, I think. I think I've covered everything.
Okay.
Hope so.
Good. Great. Thanks, Herman Ginsberg. Emil Herman Ginsberg, signing off.
Thanks, Steve Ginsberg. Son number 2. No, son number 1.
Child number 2.
Child number 2.
All right.
Even greater interest in constructing a new building started when David Alpert from Sioux City in 1960 addressed the board about his experience as building chairman for their new temple, which was constructed in 1955. He also detailed all the advantages their congregation realized following their construction. Discussions at Temple Judah about constructing a new building continued through 1963, culminating in a motion to proceed with the building project. Further, the motion stated that indebtedness should be limited to $50,000, with the expectation that the total cost would be $303,000. Thanks to Dr. Maurice Estes and Dr. Gerald Greenblatt, they had secured pledges from the Jewish community of over $230,000. A groundbreaking ceremony occurred on November 2, 1963. The transfer of the Torahs and the laying of the cornerstone took place on August 30th, 1964. And here we are, a century later, enjoying the benefits of those early innovators and pathfinders. They not only include rabbis, temple boards, and sisterhoods, but also the generosity of our philanthropists and the support of our community. We are blessed to continue to have great leaders, congregants, and benefactors to make this first 100 years possible. May the next 100 be just as wonderful.